Many people associate where I am right now with relaxation and recreation. If you're like me, you like to enjoy the sunshine, a margarita, or four. But on September 29th, 1565, this place would be anything but sunshine and margaritas. In fact, when the sun would set on this day, these dunes behind me will be covered in French blood. So we're going to explore what happened here and learn why this inlet will forever bear the name Matanzas. In my first episode, we covered the French settling Fort Caroline in 1564 outside of what is now Jacksonville. Well, a year later, in 1565, the Spanish would settle St. Augustine. Now, when you have two nations vying for territory in the New World, only about 40 miles apart, there's bound to be conflict. That conflict would come to head in September of 1565. While the French were having their fleet scattered on the east coast of Florida, Pedro Menendez and about 400 Spanish would march north towards Fort Caroline. They would find it lightly defended because most of the French were scattered along the east coast of Florida, and they would massacre about 130 people. A small contingent of women and children did survive, along with the first governor, René de Laudonnière, who would eventually make his way to England and then back to France. But that would happen on September 23rd, and unfortunately the French weren't there to defend it. So shortly after Fort Caroline was taken by the Spanish and burned, Pedro Menendez was alerted by the Timucuan Indians of a contingent of French soldiers trying to make their way back to Fort Caroline. So he left the main body of his army, about 300 soldiers, in Fort Caroline, and he marched south to our current location with about 50 to 70 men, depending on what literature you read. And they would come here. So Pedro Menendez and his forces would be right here. And in this far bank, where the houses are, that's where about 120 French survivors trying to make their way back to Fort Caroline would be gathered. Now, it's important to remember, although the French outnumbered the Spanish in this area, they were in no condition to fight. Again, they were shipwrecked. They swam ashore, most likely without food, water, their weapons. And it would take them days to get back to this inlet where we are now. So once they encountered the Spanish, they put up no resistance. So obviously this bridge was not here in 1565, but Pedro Menendez would begin to ferry the French survivors, about 110 to 120 of them, from this shoreline here, and bringing them by boat to this shoreline, about 10 at a time. Now, once a group of 10 would be ferried across, they would be marched along this sand and back into these dunes. And in these dunes, they met their final moments. At the end of the day, 111 French would lie dead in these dunes behind me. After the first group of French, about 111 in all, were killed in these dunes, 2 weeks later, on October 11th, another group of French arrived on that same bank that we saw earlier in the video. This time, Jean Ribault, their leader, was among them. Well, they would meet their same fate. They would surrender, they would be ferried across the inlet, and they'd be massacred just like the first group was. Now, all in all, about 300 French would be massacred in these dunes behind me, but there were 16 survivors that the Spanish spared. A small group agreed to convert to Catholicism. Another small group were impressed into the Spanish military, and another small group, their skills were needed at the new colony of St. Augustine. Now you're probably wondering why this inlet is called Matanzas. Well, Matanzas is Spanish for slaughters or massacre. Well, since that day, this river behind me and the inlet we saw have been called Matanzas. The history wouldn't end here, so I'll give you a little insight into a future episode. But about 200 years later, the Spanish would build this outpost, and this outpost is called Fort Matanzas. Now, per Spanish records, the current Matanzas Inlet was about 100 or 150 yards north of its current location. And here's just an updated map showing where the inlet currently is. As you saw, that other map had the inlet closer to Fort Matanzas. It's about 100, 150 yards. Since I've been doing this, something that I've thought about was, what if the French haven't hit that hurricane and they were able to attack St. Augustine? Things probably would have ended up different, but we obviously know the story and what happened. So the best thing we can do now is just learn from it. I've grown up in Florida all my life. I've been amazed at how much history has been right here in North Florida, especially in the 1500s and 1600s.